They held the future in their hands 7 years before Apple, yet they chose to bury it. This is how the king of mobile phones committed the most expensive suicide in corporate history. This is the vanished era, and today, we uncover the dark reality behind the tragic collapse of Nokia. They held the future in their hands 7 years before Apple, yet they chose to bury it. This is how the king of mobile phones committed the most expensive suicide in corporate history. This is the vanished era, and today, we uncover the dark reality behind the tragic collapse of Nokia. The story of Nokia is not just the story of a failed company. It is a haunting psychological study of how success can become a cage, and how arrogance can blind even the most brilliant minds on the planet. To understand how a giant worth $250 billion vanished, we must first look at the sheer scale of their dominance. In the early 2000s, Nokia was more than a brand. It was a global superpower. Controlling over 40% of the global market, they were the undisputed kings. If you were in a crowded street in London, a small village in India, or a business hub in New York, the iconic Nokia ringtone was the soundtrack of the era. They had built a reputation for indestructibility with models like the 3310 and the 1100, devices that became cultural legends for their battery life and physical toughness. But while the world looked at Nokia as an immovable mountain, the foundation was already rotting from within. The tragedy truly began in 2004 in a high-security research lab in Espoo, Finland, years before Steve Jobs even dreamt of the iPad. Nokia's engineers had created a fully functional touchscreen tablet with wireless internet connectivity. It was a revolutionary piece of technology that could have changed the world a decade early. However, when the prototype was presented to the top-tier management, it was met with cold laughter. The leadership at Nokia was so obsessed with their current profit margins from physical keyboards and traditional buttons that they viewed the touch screen as a child's toy. They told their engineers that no serious professional would ever want to smear their fingerprints on a screen. By rejecting this prototype, Nokia didn't just reject a product, they rejected the future itself. This was the first major nail in their coffin, a decision born from a corporate culture that had become too big to listen and too rich to innovate. To understand the true depth of this failure, we must examine the internal chaos that was hidden behind their glass office walls. While the world saw a unified tech giant, the reality was a collection of warring factions. Nokia's software engineers were trapped in a legacy system called Symbian, which had been designed in an era when phones were only meant for calling and texting. As the world moved toward complex applications and heavy data usage, Symbian became a bloated, unmanageable mess of code. It was so difficult to work with that a simple task like adding a new icon to the home screen could take months of meetings and thousands of lines of manual coding. While Apple was building iOS from scratch with a modern vision, Nokia's leaders were trying to put a new engine into a horse-drawn carriage. This technical debt was the silent killer. Managers were so focused on hitting quarterly sales targets that they refused to let engineers rebuild the operating system from the ground up. They chose the path of least resistance, making small, incremental updates that failed to excite the market. This led to a sunk cost fallacy where the company kept throwing billions of dollars into a dying platform simply because they had already invested so much time in it. When the iPhone was finally revealed in 2007, the reaction inside Nokia was one of total denial. Instead of seeing it as a threat, they analyzed the iPhone's hardware and concluded it was a failure. They mocked its poor call quality, its fragile screen, and its lack of a physical keypad. They were looking at the world through the lens of hardware durability, while Apple was looking through the lens of software experience. The psychological state of Nokia's leadership during the mid-2000s was one of toxic overconfidence. They didn't just ignore their competitors, they looked down on them with contempt. When Google announced Android, Nokia's executives dismissed it as a fragmented, amateur attempt at a mobile OS. They believed that no one could match their global supply chain or their relationships with telecom carriers. This arrogance created a filter bubble where only good news reached the top. If a middle manager tried to warn the board that the iPhone was capturing the hearts of the youth, they were often silenced or accused of being pessimistic. This created a culture of organizational silence where the truth became the most dangerous thing to speak. Nokia's board was made up of older men who understood finance and manufacturing, but they didn't understand the cool factor or the emotional connection users were forming with their devices. They viewed the phone as a utility, like a toaster or a vacuum cleaner, failing to see that it was becoming a digital extension of the human identity. By the time they realized the shift, the cool kids had already moved to Apple, and the tech-savvy crowd had moved to Android. Nokia was trapped in their own history, building a fortress that kept everyone out while Apple and Google were building ecosystems that invited the world to create. One of the least discussed reasons for Nokia's death was their complete failure to understand the app economy. Before the App Store existed, Nokia actually had its own digital storefront called OV Store. On paper, they were ahead of the game. However, their execution was a disaster. Because Nokia had hundreds of different phone models with different screen sizes and resolutions, developers hated working with them. If you built an app for one Nokia phone, it probably wouldn't work on the next one without massive changes. Apple, on the other hand, offered developers a single platform with a consistent set of tools. Nokia's fragmentation killed developer interest. The world's best coders stopped building for Nokia and started building for the iPhone. This created a vicious cycle. Fewer apps meant fewer customers, and fewer customers meant even fewer developers. Nokia tried to throw money at the problem, paying companies to build apps for Symbian, but you cannot buy a culture of innovation. The gravity of the market had shifted. Nokia went from being the platform that everyone wanted to be on to the platform that everyone was trying to escape. The internal politics became so toxic that different departments within Nokia began treating each other like enemies. Engineers were afraid to report bad news to the management, leading to a culture of fear where everyone pretended everything was fine. While the ship was clearly sinking, the final blow came with the infamous burning platform memo. By the time Nokia realized they were losing, they were desperate. They hired Stephen Alop from Microsoft, who compared the company to a man standing on a burning oil rig, who had to jump into the freezing sea to survive. Alop, a former Microsoft executive, was brought in to save the company, but many in Finland still view him as a Trojan horse. His memo, while brutally honest, had a devastating effect on Nokia's stock price and brand value. It told the world that Nokia's current products were trash, and it told them months before the new Windows phones were even ready for sale. This effectively killed the sales of Symbian phones overnight, leaving Nokia with no revenue while they waited for Microsoft to deliver. The partnership with Microsoft was a desperate gamble that stripped Nokia of its greatest asset, its independence. By switching to Windows Phone, Nokia became just another hardware manufacturer, losing the ability to control its own software destiny. They were now at the mercy of Microsoft's slow development cycles and poor market penetration. The Lumia series was beautiful and well built, but it was a ghost town in terms of apps. The world had already moved onto the duopoly of iOS and Android, and there was no room for a third player, no matter how much money was spent on marketing. By 2012, Nokia's credit rating was downgraded to junk status. The company that once provided 40% of Finland's corporate tax revenue was now a shadow of itself. In a final act of corporate cannibalism, Microsoft bought Nokia's handset division for a measly $7 billion, a tiny fraction of what the company was worth just 5 years prior. It was a tragic end for a pioneer that had literally taught the world how to communicate. The factories were closed, the Finnish workers were laid off, and the iconic connecting people slogan was retired. What remains of Nokia today is a telecommunications equipment company, successful in its own right, but disconnected from the consumers who once loved its products. The fall of Nokia remains the greatest warning in the history of business. It proves that no matter how big your empire is, or how much gold is in your treasury, the world will not wait for you to catch up. They were the architects of the mobile revolution, yet they became the primary victims of it because they fell in love with their past successes and forgot to look at the horizon. Today, the Nokia name still exists, but the soul of the company that once connected the entire world is gone, serving as a silent reminder that in the world of technology, you either innovate or you vanish. Nokia's tragedy was not that they couldn't see the future, but that they saw it, held it in their hands, and decided it wasn't worth the risk. As we look at the giants of today, we have to wonder who among them is currently ignoring the very invention that will eventually lead to their own funeral. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the vanished era of the Mobile King. Don't forget to subscribe as we continue to explore the empires that time forgot.